Absolutely. Ranjeet.
If I make it very small.
No, please come.
Just pushing the camera. Absolutely. Hello. So thanks all for that, like some brilliant contributions and points. I think there's a question I want to ask, and to make a kind of a very brief kind of look at my experience of industrial action of the medical profession, which is like not really a profession. It's like they don't consider themselves workers. They've been pushed to consider themselves a profession, a professional body who can negotiate, not like other workers who really are paid a wage. But really, they have the same strategy and tactics as we've looked at here. If I go back to 2014, I participated in the first industrial action of doctors since the 70s. And it was trying to guard against casualization, decreased pay and conditions, and decreased ability to whistle, blow, and safeguard the service. So it was key. A new contract was introduced that was key to really dismantling the National Health Service as we knew it up until that time. The struggle was initially coordinated by people who were politically Tories. They were right wing but connected. They were just asking for a bit more money. They couldn't see why they couldn't get it, and they organised it in quite a effective way, in a way that they weren't trying to upend the system, but they thought through dialogue they'd achieve their ends. At a certain point, they had a quiet word with, and they essentially dropped the struggle and handed it over to a group who considered themselves. I met some of them. I met them on several occasions. They considered themselves far left, by which they were probably semi-Trotskyite, but mainly just Labour Party. They were Labour Party, and in particular at that time, it was the kind of Corbyn had just become the elected leader of the Labour Party, and their ultimate aim was to use the strike as a vehicle to promote Jeremy Corbyn as the answer to all problems, including of the junior doctors. Now, we have a lot of laws that make it difficult to have industrial action. You have to have overwhelming support. The ballots have to be run and supervised in a certain manner. But they went through all those hoops and they had overwhelming support of the profession for the action. But once this group took over, first of all, they suspended action for a long period of time without any communication with the membership. None of us knew what was happening at all, what the next step was going to be, whether we were going to have industrial action. It was just total like black box, no communication. And then suddenly they announced, after this very long pause, previously we had quite short periods of limited action preserving the on-call service so that we wouldn't alienate the workers who use the service, who we care about, and we wouldn't endanger our patients, but we'd put pressure on the government to negotiate. And then this new leadership sprang into action and said, in 1 week's time, we're going to come out on total strike. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be a 7-week, so 1 week of total withdrawal of all cover, of everything. So it would have led to total collapse of the service. And you couldn't have designed a better strategy for going from pretty much 100% support of the profession for the action to like 0%. Everyone was like, well, it's just too much. We can't possibly do that. There's not enough time. How are we going to do it? There's no communication. What will happen to our patients? This is unethical. How can I do it? I can't justify it. So it was like just gone. No support at all. At which point they said, there's no longer any support for industrial action. Full stop. And that was the end of the strike. And the contract that we were fighting against was imposed. So this was 100% victory for the government over the medical profession. And it was organised by the most left, radical, pro-Corbyn, Trotskyite group of leaders of the profession. And right at this moment, not only the juniors have in strike industrial action again, they're having quite reasonable actions, 48 hours. And the consultant body have also voted to strike because we've seen our pay, we're a privileged group of workers. We're like tube drivers. Right now we're in industrial action again. The consultants, as well as the junior doctors, are currently in industrial action within the NHS. And we are unquestionably a privileged group of workers we are like tube drivers. But consultants' pay has gone down 35% over the last 15 years. So it's a huge drop, whilst inflation obviously has gone up. And there were a couple of points I wanted to make about it. So they're in action again at the moment, the consultants and the juniors, but they don't coordinate their action. So it's a bit random. Some are on strike now, some on strike again. At the moment, they're in a phase of totally ineffective action that the government at the moment is showing every sign of totally ignoring. And really, it's another plank. They've already defeated the nurses whose unions told them you can't get more than 5%, so they've stopped. And several unions have capitulated, and they're saying the same thing to the medical profession, the different branches. So our radiographers are going to come out on strike in a week's time. They're also being told they'll only get 5%. So every single branch of the NHS employees are involved in industrial action. And there is zero coordination between each of the different branches. You couldn't design like a less effective tactic of struggle. And you know, the main thing that they're going to hit the consultants in particular with is, you already get so much money, how dare you ask for more money? But if you think about it, it's exactly what they say to tube drivers. You know, I'll keep on drawing this parallel because there are a branch of skilled workers, many within the country, who have higher pay than average. But they like to individualize, attack, and destroy solidarity between all workers in this way. I say we're like tube drivers. There of course is a difference. I once had a tree surgeon who came to see me in clinic, and I said, God, you guys get paid more than us. And he goes, ha ha, I know. And the best thing about it is I had a 6-week course back in 1974, and I've been taking £1,000 a day ever since. And so there is a difference. A true tube driver will take about 6 weeks to train, and a consultant doctor takes about 15 to 20 years to train. Don't worry.
He was just moaning about how long it takes.
But the bottom line is that the same thing is happening across every branch of the workforce. We're encouraged to think very individually, not to think collectively. But the reality is, inflation and decreased wages are robbing us all. Increased cost of living is robbing us all. And in particular for the NHS, all of the grades of pay have been eroded to the point that they're going to become profitable to operate in the private sector. So it's a key plank of their privatization of the whole service is to cheapen labour across the board. And certainly at the lower end of the scale of the NHS, you've got people who are regularly, you've got a large number of our staff who subsist on food banks. This was meant to be just a brief background to the only question I really have. And to me, if you really want to look back at effective trade union struggle in the UK, you have to look at the Clydeside workers and the shop stewards movement of the 1920s and the war period. And they knew very well to be effective, you had to use the organised combined power of the working class, coordinate industrial action. If one factory went on dispute, they held meetings in the evening and they expanded that across the whole sector and sometimes across the whole city and sometimes across the whole nation. And they escalated very quickly to the point that the bosses were drawn to the table and they conceded demands, sometimes small demands, about half an hour on a day, about work breaks, going into struggle for the working class, organising them in such a way that they were effective, that they threatened, the profits of the capitalists. The capitalists were forced to make a concession quickly to restore profitability of their industry. And then you showed the working class through this action the benefit of unionization, that if you win, people want to be unionized. People want to be involved in the struggle because it's actually inspiring to see your collective power and to start to win concessions. So I guess that's what I think. And if you see from that point on, why were they effective now and not later? Ironically, it was the working class who, in their desire to fight anti-union legislation, who said we must have an organisation that represents us not only in the workplace, but politically. And what did they come out of that? I'm afraid at the first Congress of the Labour Party, when they were changing the Labour Representation Committee into the Labour Party, They explicitly rejected the idea of having an organisation that would recognise class war and fight for power of the working class. Instead, they would have an organisation to represent the interests of workers in Parliament. So they limited themselves to the confines of the bourgeois democratic system from the outset. And more particularly, I mean, all of this was triggered really because I saw a tweet recently in which Labour Party people are saying, let's get Keir Starmer in, we'll get the Labour Party in, and we'll repeal anti-trade union legislation. And so you can see the way in which the law has been used to limit, workers' ability to strike and their ability to win strikes, their ability to expand in the miners' strike, flying pickets, expanding the strike from pit to pit to pit across the industry was sabotaged. The Labour Party played a key role in stopping other unions from coming out in solidarity action. That's illegal. We can't do it. We put our funds at stake. What are we going to do with our pension investment? We've got a multi-billion portfolio we've got to protect. How can we come into conflict with the state? So we've switched from being the militant representatives of workers in struggle facilitating their victory. The trade union movement connected with the Labour Party became a mechanism of state control of the working class, keeping them in their place, keeping their wages low, which is actually precisely what we're told was bad about fascist unions under the aegis of Hitler and Mussolini. It's of course a great unionization, but they worked as parts of the state to suppress labour. But what have we actually got? From the Labour Party and its history of struggle, we've got a great organisation which coordinates with the state to suppress workers, keep them low paid, and keep their limits of even their proposition. What can we achieve within the narrow horizons of bourgeois law, i.e. to keep them wage slaves? So I guess for me, what we need to do most of all is to get to the point where the workers can organise small victories and start to draw working class back into class struggle. That to me seems the most obvious way around the anti-union laws. I wonder what you think.
vers la victoire, plutôt que les maintenir dans le même système.
From the floor. Questions, contributions.
My question is, it was sort of answered actually with the rest of the conversation, but when you said, we talked about organised, they actually had an organised block strike that was proposed. And everyone got cold feet and thought, no, we can't possibly do this, and then which completely defeated the position you're all in. But what I wanted to ask at the time was, do you think that was because of the profession? Would it have been the same had it been train drivers or whatever? It's that sense of responsibility to the was your bluff called? Were the health workers at that time was their bluff called? The point is, would they now go for that strike?
Thanks, Lucy. What's spoken long enough? But so I think this is one of the other biggest obstacles to successful action within the health sector, is that we're all ethically driven, and quite rightly so, by a love of our job and care for the patient, right? So everything is basically orientated towards caring for the sick, caring for the needy. It's like a valuable social profession. That's part of everyone's status. If you work as a receptionist in the NHS, you feel proud that you're serving the community and helping the people. If you work as a nurse, you feel very proud of the job that you do. You put up with a certain amount of hardship. And it's almost like a point of pride. We don't do this for the money. You couldn't pay us for what we do. And even doctors, even ones who have private practice, basically are still governed by that ethical consideration. As you get to the more high-paid sectors, they're also governed by a consideration that, it pays them more to maximize their work than maximize their, strike action and destructive nature. They think they can bargain, professionally maneuver or just expand the amount of work they do get into the private sector. They'll get more money that way. So they're conflicting things that stop us from working. At a certain point, people have got to the point now where they say, look, the service itself is broken. They do feel that if you pay people low enough, if you don't pay the staff in the NHS, there's no NHS. So retention is a real problem, particularly for middle and low paid grades, professions. For nurses, there's a huge retention problem because if you work as a nurse in London, you can't afford to live in London. You can barely afford to rent a place. You can't afford to bring up a family. If you go through any social hardship at all, you've gone beyond the breadline. You're on food banks, which is why that's a common and true story. And I've certainly known nurses who lived in London but commuted from somewhere near Luton because it was a place they could afford a tiny, brand new box home, one up, one down. I can afford that, just about get on the housing ladder, and you're in and out traveling. So, but that's not, so but also there's tremendous public support for the National Health Service, even now when it's being deliberately broken and there's massive waiting lists and there's discontent. People's experiences, they need it, they depend it, they love it, they'll do anything to support it. That's the general population. So it's very important for health unions when they strike to say very directly there's a link between what we're striking for and saving the service. So and everyone feels at that breaking point that that's basically what they're striking about. It's like a existential issue for the profession, whether it's doctors or nurses or radiographers. They all feel that way. Normally what's lacking is that communication from the leadership of the unions to the public and their coordination and messaging to their own union. They don't do a lot of organising work. They don't speak to their members. It's almost like they put out a ballot, everyone supports that, and that's it. That was your role. And they'll say, go to a picket. Well, people don't like going to pickets. They don't know why they're going. There's no meeting. They're not discussing how to handle the press. They see the press. They see themselves being attacked. They feel a bit awkward about it. And they just, even though something like 87% of the BMA, for example, voted for industrial action, turnout in some places has been like in the 20s to 30s.
To the pickets?
Yeah, not to the pickets, no. Turnout as in people who declared themselves as striking. They're not even sure exactly, the figures are not sure who was striking, who wasn't, because people are encouraged to maintain the service all the time. So they're disorganised by the management, but they're not organised by the union. So it's possible to have a successful action. It needs the union to act as a union, to fight to win, to take the profession with them and to communicate with the public. And that's what's just very lacking. It's what me feels. I look at the action, I see, well, it's not going to work. I can see my own colleagues who feel, the justice of their cause, totally shamefaced about it and demoralised and disorganised, and without any decent arguments to muster. So it's fighting to lose from the outset. Usually Rishi Sunak, you guys are going to get 6% after one that, well, actually now you've not negotiated, you're going to get 5%. He's coming out like a second-hand car dealer. He doesn't give a damn whether the NHS functions for us or not, because they're deliberately destroying the service. And so if you strike to save the service, you're attacked as the people who are disrupting, you're causing terrible hardship. They never talk about the way they're running down the service or the millions on waiting lists, unless it's to say, well, what we should do is push people out to the independent sector where, we might have some interest and you make more money. So there's a constant pressures of privatisation from Labour and Tory, unspoken, whilst our actual, professions are themselves uneducated about what's happening. They don't know. And then when things get bad enough, they feel the service is collapsing, they want to strike. The strike is totally mishandled and mismanaged. That's what we've got. So it's possible to win. It's not just the profession, it's the way it's conducted.